So I chose as a topic today the yoga of the Bhagavad-Gita for many reasons. First of all, because I haven't lectured about the Bhagavad-Gita in something like 20 years. My first public lecture was actually on the Bhagavad-Gita. My Sanskrit teacher allowed me to hold a lecture at the University of Luxembourg during my first year, and it was quite a moving experience. I have a bit of a love story with the Bhagavad Gita because it's a text that I've known since I was a teenager. The first time I got hold of a copy of the Bhagavad Gita was probably one of the most beautiful days of my life. I was 16 years old, and I went to Trier in Germany. And lo and behold, I was looking for the Bhagavad Gita for ages. And then lo and behold, there was a copy of the Bhagavad Gita translated by a really good German scholar, Leopold von Schröder. Actually, German translations tend to be far better. And it's a text that really changed my life. And it's a text that still gives me a great deal of solace. And it's a text that, belongs to it's basically, India's gift to the world. It's and so it's part of the common heritage of humanity, and one doesn't necessarily need to be, part of one of the Hindu religions to really appreciate its beauty. Although, learning Sanskrit does help, and very fortunately, I was able to find a teacher before going to university who taught me Sanskrit. And so, yes, it's a text that is very dear to me. And one could spend, centuries just basically lecturing on it because it's such a beautiful and deep text. Before I start, I'm just going to basically give salutations to Krishna. Om Krishnaya Vasudevaya Devaki Nandanaya Cha Nanda Gopa Kumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha. Hail to Krishna, son of Vasudeva, bliss of Devaki, the boy of Nanda and the Gopas. Hail to Govinda. So here is the plan of the lecture. So the yoga of the Bhagavad Gita. The plan of the lecture is the Bhagavad-Gita, a very short introduction. That's for people who are not familiar with the content of the Bhagavad-Gita and should be familiar with it because it's such a wonderful text. And then understanding yoga, so Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, so the original yoga system. Then I'll talk about the three yogas that are mentioned in the Bhagavad-Gita, namely Karamayoga, Dhyana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. And then finally, we'll have a close reading of the sixth canto of the Bhagavad-Gita that basically deals with Dhyana Yoga, so the path of meditation. So why have I chosen this topic? Because very often, and this is something I've noticed in Muslim, let's say, intellectual circles that discuss mysticism, much of the discussion deals with theoretical, metaphysical issues. And I come from a completely different direction. I came really from the I've always had a deep interest in practical mysticism, not so much in metaphysics or philosophy, so on and so forth. You're going to apologize that the story I'm going to tell you now, but there's a very famous Tibetan saint by the name of Drukpa Kunle, who's known as one of the crazy saints of Tibet. And so he had this very paradoxical and trickster way of behaving, and he was always trying to remind, especially the monks, that they should really focus on the practical aspect of the Dharma, of the path of the Buddha, instead of really emphasizing and getting lost in the theoretical sciences such as metaphysics, logic, and so forth. Not that they're not useful; they are useful. But my experience is that, especially when I go to places like Qom, I have these people who spend their lives reading books on Irfan, and they're literally floating 2 meters above the ground. But they have no praxis. They have no contemplative praxis. Their Irfan is basically book Irfan, and which basically is that it's no Irfan whatsoever. And I think it's important to really go back to the basic text and notice that so much emphasis is actually given to the practical mysticism, to the very practice of contemplation. So Drukpa Kunle encounters 2 monks who are having this metaphysical discussion. And so he comes up to them and says, "Dear gentlemen, I have a metaphysical problem that needs solving." And the 2 monks were only too happy to, acquiesce. And so, what is the problem? And then basically Drukpa Kunle farts in their faces and then asks, "I have a problem. Which thing comes first, the air or the smell?" So it's a very paradoxical way of making a point, but and as you'll probably all have noticed, I have a taste for very sophisticated humor. But the point here is that there comes a time when the lengthy discussions about metaphysics tend to cloud the importance, tend to make people forget the importance of practice, and that basically it's all fine and dandy discussing lofty concepts like Wahdat al-Wujud or Wahdat al-Shuhud or Advaita Vedanta or Kashmiri Shaivism and so forth. But the thing is this: if you don't spend at least half an hour a day, in serious practice, doing some sort of contemplative practice, at least half an hour, there's a problem. And so this is the reason why I chose this theme, because it's one that I think is really of relevance. So the Bhagavad-Gita is basically a song. So it's the term Bhagavad-Gita literally means the song of the Lord. So Gita is song, Bhagavan means the Lord. It comes from the root bhajati, to share. And bhakti, which is devotion, is derived from that same root. The idea of love between the Lord and the soul is one of sharing, basically. Of course, there's when it comes to Indian texts, it's always very difficult to date them. So the experts tend to think that it's probably composed around the 3rd century. Some say the 4th, some say the 2nd century. I think that so it's just safe to say the 3rd century. So it's composed of 18 cantos, 18 songs, and 700 shloka verses. So the context, what is the context? There's a huge war between 2 clans, the Kauravas and the Pandavas, who are cousins. And so this was brought about as a result of rivalries and humiliations between both sides. And on the eve of battle, the champion of the Pandavas, Arjuna, asks his charioteer, Krishna, to drive his chariot to the middle of the battlefield in order to contemplate the enemy army, among whom, apart his cousins, are also his teacher Drona and the great Bhishma, for whom he has nothing but deep love and respect. And overtaken by depression, he questions his purpose and the very reason for this war. Krishna then exhorts him to wake up, to take up arms, and imparts crucial wisdom teachings that eventually convince Arjuna to perform his duty for the sake of Dharma. So it's a text that the Bhagavad-Gita is a text that is situated within a context, but at the same time completely transcends this context and finds universal relevance for people throughout the ages, because the crisis that Arjuna goes through is one that is an existential crisis that many people go through. Krishna, of course, there's two Krishnas, right? Well, it's the same person, but so there's the Krishna of the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad-Gita, who is a person who imparts teachings of wisdom. And then there's the Krishna of the Bhagavata Purana and the rest of the Vaishnava literature, who's the boy of Vrindavana who plays pranks on his relatives and protects his village from demonic attacks, and who is also beloved by Radha. And Krishna is considered in the Vaishnava tradition as a full avatara, a descent of God. And so the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita are a sort of self-declaration by God through Krishna. Now, before we go into the theme of the yoga of the Bhagavad Gita, and especially the 6th chapter, which deals with meditation, let's look at the philosophical context of this discussion, which is the Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali. So Patanjali was a sage who composed the canonical work on yoga, which is the Yoga Sutras, which were composed around the 4th century BC. And so, according to him, the yoga system, which is a philosophical system that deals specifically with experiential knowledge of the divine, is divided into eight limbs that are not necessarily stages, but rather 8 elements that need to be practiced simultaneously. The word yoga comes from the Sanskrit root yuj, yunakti, which means to join. And you find the Indo-European equivalences for example, in the Latin jungere, to join or unite, in the German yoch, or the English yoke, yoga, yoke. It's the same idea. And so, for example, in the Vedas, you find the word yoga used, but it means yoke, literally a yoke to which you either attach horses or basically other types of animals. So, for example, if there's a war situation, you'll find the reference of like bring the yoga, and that means basically bring the yoke that will attach the 2 horses of the war chariot. It's got no real relation to basically what we're discussing now, which is a mystical philosophical system. So the eight limbs of yoga are yama, which are rules, niyama, which are observances, asana, the positions, pranayama, which is the mastery of breath, pratyahara, which is the withdrawal of the senses, dharana, which is concentration, dhyana, which means meditation, samadhi, which is the ecstatic, the deep, it's an altered state of superior state of consciousness, where the consciousness and the intellect are in balance and equilibrium, and are united with the object of meditation. So Patanjali defines yoga in the following way. He says, yogaschita vritti nirodha. So nirodha normally gets translated by stopping, but it also has the idea of containing something, which is why I translated it as mastery. So yoga is the mastery of the fluctuations of the mind. So fluctuations here is vritti. Vritti in Sanskrit means, it's the notion of rolling. and even the notion of a whirlpool in a lake or a stream. So in a sense, the mind or consciousness are likened to a either a river or a lake, and then the flow of thoughts of any kind, emotions or just any type of mental activity is likened to basically the ripples or the waves or the whirlpools within either the stream or the lake. And then he says, Tada drashtu stupe vastanam. So then the seer stands in his own nature. So what do we mean here? It's not about, so that's why I translated Nirodha as mastery rather than stopping the fluctuations of the mind, because you can never stop thinking. Anyone who tells you that meditation is about, having no thoughts or stopping to think is taking you for a ride, because we never stop thinking. We always have thoughts. What's happening here is that your center of consciousness is no longer going to be attached or is no longer going to identify itself to these different fluctuations of the mind. Rather, it's going to retrieve to the deeper levels of the self and achieve and realize its true nature, which is, Satchit Ananda, being, consciousness, and bliss. And because otherwise, right, as he says, vritti sarupyam ittaratra means, so otherwise there is identification with the fluctuation. So either you are in a state of kaivalya, so your true self is resting is resting in the state of deep peace and realizes who what it really is, or, and that's the situation of 99.9% of people, we identify ourselves with the fluctuations of the mind. The fluctuations of the mind are not just conscious thoughts that we're having, it's also unconscious ideas that have been the result of either socialization or, for example, experiences we've had in deep childhood, right? So, and what yoga teaches us is that, these things that we identify with are not really our true self, right? And it's really important to state this. Our true self, our fitra, is something that basically is detached from the fluctuations of the mind, are either the result of our active thinking or are part and parcel of the unconscious that is working with all of this material it's been accumulating over time as a result of either experience or socialization. So the aim of yoga is kaivalya, is isolation of the true nature from the whirling fluctuations of the mind. Kaivalya is attained by applying the 8 limbs of the yoga path, starting with a yama, restraint, itself composed of the following universal principles: ahimsa, satya, asteya, brahmacharya, aparigraha. So ahimsa is non-hurting or non-violence. And it's actually the principle that that constitutes the context for all the other principles. So ahimsa, of course, means different things according to the stage of life in which you're in. So ahimsa for a Brahmin is different from ahimsa for a Kshatriya or warrior, right? A warrior has to defend his community. But ahimsa means here that, for example, you will not exert violence beyond what is necessary, for example. So the idea that it's the idea that ahimsa is what Gandhi referred to as his definition of ahimsa, it's wrong. The Shastras are very clear about that. Ahimsa differs according to the station in life in which you're in. But really, it's also even when you have to exert violence in order to defend your home or your family or your country, it should be done without hatred. There's no necessity to hate your enemy. You're just defending yourself, right? Then comes satya, which is truth, telling the truth. But that is also conditional on ahimsa. So, for example, if someone is being, persecuted by, a bunch of criminals, being pursued by a bunch of criminals, and you're hiding that person in your house, the principle of ahimsa takes over the principle of satya. So in this situation, you're of course allowed to basically hide the truth from the people who want to kill that person, right? So keeping that in mind. But the idea is still, satya is extremely important. Why? Because if you align yourself with truth, if you are in the habit of always saying the truth, whatever you say then also becomes truth. And that's something that's addressed specifically in the 3rd chapter of the Yoga Sutras. There's people who are in the habit of saying the truth. Whatever they say eventually becomes truth. So the relationship between speaking truth and then reality is a two-way street according to the Yoga Sutras. Asteya means not stealing, and it's not just about money, but it's also it's the idea of not looking at the world as a commodity. So some people look at trees or look at the forests, and the first thing they see is, for example, they want to transform that that forest into some sort of commercial sort of goods. Asteya is really beyond non-stealing, is cultivating attitude of not looking at other people and at other beings and nature as mere commodities to be used for ourselves. Then comes Brahmacharya. Brahmacharya is normally translated as chastity, but it's a bit more complicated. So in traditional India, there are 4 stages of life. You have the Brahmacharin, which is the young student. So up until the age you get married as a late teenager, you are a student, and during that period, you're supposed to have complete chastity in action, thought, and speech. And there's a reason why that I will explain later. So the complete continence as a child and as a teenager. As a grihasti, as a household, as a married householder, Brahmacharya means that you use sexuality for procreation, as well as basically for the purposes of marriage that are mentioned in the Kama Sutra. By the way, the Kama Sutra is, people don't understand that, but the Kama Sutra, although it's a descriptive text, it still needs to be viewed through the lens of the Dharma Shastras, which are the books of law of the Dharmic traditions. So so some people will mention some form of some types of sexuality that are mentioned of non-mainstream sexualities that are mentioned in the Kama Sutras. But at no point does Vatsyayana say, the author of the Kama Sutra, say that those are acceptable. The Kama Sutra is still subservient to the Dharma. So so sexuality within the state of the grihasti, of the householder, is that basically that is meant for the married couple, a man and a woman. And then, of course, at a certain point, the couple retires to the forest. They become vanaprashtas, and then sannyasins. So the state of brahmacharya really, the way it's lived out depends on the state where you're in. But mind you, even within married life, there's an emphasis on not exaggerating with the practice of sexuality. So, for example, even Vatsyayana in his Kama Sutra says that between each copulation, there should be a few days where you're not having intercourse, simply because, and I'll explain this later, because sexuality is deeply linked to the notion of vital energy, which is extremely important for the practice of yoga, right? So there's not only a moralistic sort of aspect to it, there's actually a practical, energetic aspect linked to the question of Brahmacharya. And then you have aparigraha, which means non-covetousness, so not wanting to, not being affected by greed, not wanting to grab onto things. So basically not being possessive. So you may have, the idea is that you may own things, but things should not own you, right? You can, and the example has always been given in the Dharma, the Dharmic traditions, is that of King Janaka, the father of Sita. King Janaka was extremely wealthy, but he was an accomplished yogi. So the idea is that you may be wealthy and still be a yogi, as long as wealth is not owning you, right? So that's the important thing to keep in mind. So that's because, especially because of the leftist victim narratives, there's always this idea that people who have less are somehow more saintly, and that is something that's not what the tradition here affirms. For a lot of people, it helps. But there are people who are completely capable of being immensely rich, while at the same time also be spiritually highly developed and even becoming basically great saints. Then come the niyamas, the observances, such as shaucha. Shaucha is cleanliness, but also ritual purity. Just like in Islam, so the Dharmic traditions have a whole range of impure substances that one should abstain from. And so it's really important to keep these rules. Then you have Santosha, which means contentment, being content with what one has, but also the situation in which one is, not being resentful, not falling into the trap of victimhood narratives. Then you get tapa, which is austerity. Train yourself to be indifferent to heat and cold, praise and blame, and so on and so forth. This is something that needs to be trained. Then you have svadhyaya, which means study. So basically, there's the idea that there is a theoretical aspect to the yoga path that one needs to study, that one needs to incorporate. And it's something that is very similar to what Sohrawardi, the Sheikh Maqtul, says, which is like, on the mystical path, there surely is an emphasis on practical mysticism, on the practice of contemplation. But this needs to be coupled also with a solid intellectual formation in logic, the study of sacred texts, and other forms of knowledge, so that you are able to understand what you are going through in your mystical experiences, and that you don't become a fodder for psychiatrists. It's very, very important. Then you have Ishvara Pranidhana. Ishvara Pranidhana means basically devotion or fixing your mind on Ishvara, the Lord. And people forget, but yes, the yoga is a religious system. There is a notion of Ishvara, of the Lord, and that you cannot really take out that element. Otherwise, that's then it's no longer at least the original Ashtanga yoga system of Patanjali. Although there is there's a Buddhist yoga and a Jain yoga as well, but the idea is having some sort of like holy figure that you adhere to and that you concentrate upon as part of your practice. So Patanjali describes the asana, so the position, the posture, in the following way: Sirasuka Asana. So posture is steady, stira, and agreeable, sukham, right? And here it's really interesting. So one of the commentators of the Yoga Sutras, Vachaspati Mishra, he mentions some 10 sitting positions. So the original yoga tradition, it really is all about sitting and meditating. And the most famous one amongst them, of course, being the Padmasana, the lotus position. There's the last one that he mentions, that's the Yatasukha or Sirasuka Asana, which is basically whatever position that you're able to hold, as long as basically your back is straight. Then yeah, that any position basically is fine. So what we have nowadays, modern yoga, is actually a very, very recent thing. It was something that was created in the 20th century by Krishnamacharya and the Iyengar family in the 20th century. It's really a mixture of modern Swedish gymnastics with some traditional postures. And because really originally, like the yogic postures, you just really have a dozen, at the maximum, a dozen postures are mentioned. There's some texts that talk about 84 postures, but that's just a symbolic number, and these postures are not even mentioned. So these texts that even talk about 84 positions, postures, they only talk about the Padmasana and the Siddhasana, which is 2 meditation postures, right? So the modern yoga is, it's a problematic issue because it's been appropriated by a certain, by the counterculture movement in the West, and it's so much at odds with the rules and the observances of the Patanjali yoga, that I really sometimes wonder how, if these people are even aware of what they're doing. And actually most of the time it's not. On a personal note, I always found these circles that practice this sort of modern yoga with like hundreds of different positions, right, to be extremely shallow and sometimes even toxic, because they're very conducive to cultic behavior. At the same time, I will not, I'm not going to completely discard it, because yoga has evolved over the centuries. So there has been, with the centuries, there's been an evolution of Hatha yoga, especially with the Gaurapanthi movement. But I mean, even that Hatha yoga is very limited. It's few 10, 12 positions really. But so yoga has evolved. So if people found new positions and thought them to be healthy and useful for people, why not? I actually do know people who combine both this modern yoga with the Patanjali, the original Patanjali system. Because if it's healthy, why not? Why not use it? But at the same time, I would be cautious about people who teach it, and because I wouldn't call it yoga. Are you just teaching postures? You're just teaching positions. You're not teaching yoga. Yoga is something else. And the yama and the niyama that I've just mentioned should give you an idea that most of the yoga instructors that you've met during your life probably don't know what they're talking about. Now, the next stage is pranayama. So the mastery of the breath. So tasmin sati shvasa prashvasa yor gati vicheda pranayama. So following that.
Next.
Yes, we reached to basically pranayama. Yeah. So as I was talking about, so ojas, this deep vitality, is contained with all of us. So it manifests itself in 2 ways. So either as prana, as vital energy that can be acquired either through food or through the control of breath, because you so the prana, this energy, is being extracted from basically from the air. And as for food, it's of course vital that that food comes from a pure source. So that's why the yoga system emphasizes so much on the idea of a sattvic diet. Yeah, the idea of a diet that is basically, a vegetarian diet, but not only vegetarian diet. It's a diet with that doesn't have many spices, and avoids a certain. For example, you won't find red chilies, for example, in sattvic food, because red chilies damage the intellect and encourage passions, for example. So sattvic food, it places. Focuses on bringing about this sattvic, this pure light energy within us. Then the other form of ojas is virya, which is vigor, and that's basically acquired through the control of your libido. So, and this is why the Brahmacharya is so important in yoga. So you cannot be a yogi and have a dissolute, sexual life. It just won't work, because the idea is that through a mastery of your libido and in the case of men, containing basically your semen, it's a way of raising the amount of energy that you have with you, basically within you, and that energy gets transformed through meditation, through pranayama, the control of breath, into spiritual energy, and that is why the emphasis on continence, on sexual purity, is not just moralistic. There's a very practical reason why there's so much emphasis on this notion, because limiting the emission of the sexual fluids enables you to acquire more life force that you can use for yogic practice. And this is something you find in other systems, such as Taoism, for example, or in Buddhism as well. So there's even within the yogi that has a a householder lifestyle. So when one has intercourse with one's spouse, a few days need to basically pass between each intercourse. Not only because you're not supposed to look at to view your spouse as a mere object that's there to please your life, to please you basically. But it's also because it's to help you in terms of keeping your energy. So the even in Buddhism, it's a very important notion. So that is why I'm a bit critical of the modern yoga scene, because so many people claim to be yogis, but at the same time have these very dissolute, lifestyles that are completely incompatible with these these are not side aspects of the yogic tradition. This is the bread and butter of yoga. Brahmacharya is extremely important. It's not some side thing that you can sort of revamp according to the taste of the day. No, this Brahmacharya is Brahmacharya, and it doesn't change really. So it's a very important teaching here. So the combination of basically the accumulation of virya, which through continence, that combined to prana creates a sort of powerhouse that enables you to acquire these higher states of consciousness. Now we go to the definition of pratyahara, which basically is the withdrawal of the senses. So Patanjali says, Svavishaya Vishayas Samprayoge Atasya Sarupam Anukara Irendriyanam Pratyahara. So withdrawal through that. Withdrawal is that through which the senses do not come in contact with their objects and follow as if it were the nature of the mind. So the idea is like a tortoise that is basically withdrawing its limbs, towards basically the center. Likewise, one should withdraw our attention from the objects of the senses towards the heart. Basically, that's what it means. So that's the first stage of meditation, which is basically withdrawing the attention from the senses, from the object of the senses, towards basically the center. Then desha bandha chitasya dharana. So fixity in one place, desha bandha. Fixity in one place, steadfastness of the mind is concentration. Right? So it's the effort of concentrating on one object of meditation. Then you have the definition of meditation itself, Dhyana. Tatra pratyayaka dhanata dhyanam. So meditation is one continuous flow of consciousness. So it's the holding of dharana, of concentration, within basically a continuous flow, right? And then you have the definition of samadhi, which is the highest stage within basically meditation. Tadeva artha matra nirbhasam sarupa shunyam iva. So samadhi is the shining of the object alone, devoid of its form. What it means here is that your consciousness has become one with the object of meditation, so that your consciousness has become the form of the object of meditation. And the combination of dharana, dhyana, and samadhi is known as samyama. And samyama plays an important role, especially in the third chapter of the Yoga Sutras, which is the attainment of the siddhis, of the powers, of the accomplishments, in that we don't have time to discuss here. So now we move to the Bhagavad-Gita itself. So the Bhagavad-Gita mentions 4 yogas, right? The Karamayoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga, and the Raja Yoga or Dhyana Yoga. So of these 4 types, there are 3 that are very prominent amongst the commentators. So you have Karamayoga, which is a yoga of action, where the yogi performs his or her svadharma in the best way possible and relinquishes the fruits of the actions to the Lord. So in whichever station of life you find yourself in, whether you're a Brahmin or a Kshatriya or a student or a Shudra or whatever, as long as you perform your action with no hope of reward, just for the sake of performing the action in and of itself, and you leave to God the fruit of the action, the result of the action, that is basically Karma Yoga. So it's very Confucian in a way. It's performing what's right for the sake of the right, and not for some ulterior motive, and performing it for God, right? So that whatever position one finds ourselves, whether one is a university professor or a musician, or a a construction worker or a carpenter, as long as you perform your action properly and without looking for ulterior motives. So it's really the idea of performing the action for the sake of the action itself and offering that effort to the Lord. Then basically, yes, that's Karma Yoga. It's a way of cleansing the intentions, your intentions, basically, from the work that you do, right? Then you have Jnana Yoga, which is the Yoga of Gnosis. So the yogi undergoes a spiritual journey to experientially know the self, the world, and God in its formless, hidden aspect. Right? That's how the Bhagavad-Gita basically talks about it. And it's a form of yoga that is very prominent, especially amongst the Advaita Vedanta school. Then you have Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of loving devotion, which is the more popular yoga of the Bhagavad-Gita, as the yogi approaches God in his cataphatic, in his manifest aspect through devotion, right? Now, there's a discussion in the Bhagavad-Gita as to, the differences between Jnana Yoga, the Yoga of Gnosis, and Bhakti. And so Arjuna asks Krishna, Evam satata yukta ye paksasam paryupasate yechapi aksharam abhyaktam tisham ke yoga vitama. So Arjuna says, those devotees who ever steadfast thus worship thee, and those who worship the imperishable, the unmanifested, which of them are better versed in yoga? And then Krishna replies, those who fixing their mind on me, worship me ever steadfast, and endowed with supreme faith, they, in my opinion, are best versed in yoga. But those who worship the imperishable, the indefinable, the unmanifested, the omnipresent, the unthinkable, the unchangeable, the immovable, the eternal, having subdued all senses, even-minded everywhere, engaged in the welfare of all beings, they too reach only myself. Greater is their trouble, whose minds are set on the unmanifested. For the goal of the unmanifested is very hard for the embodied to reach. So Jnana Yoga is completely within the realm of possibilities, but it's an extremely difficult one. It's reserved for small number of people. Bhakti Yoga really is seen as the ship of salvation because it's accessible to the greater number, and also because it takes into account that we are embodied beings, and because we're embodied beings, we tend to view God through that sort of lens, and Bhakti Yoga enables that. There's a whole text known as the Narada Bhakti Sutras that gives the theory of Bhakti Yoga, and so and Bhakti Yoga is essentially really a Vaishnava phenomenon. So the idea is reaching God through love of his avatars, right? And developing a relationship with the avatar, either by viewing, for example, Krishna as your friends, or by viewing Krishna as your son. So you take on the position of either Devaki or Nanda or Vasudeva or Yashoda, and you view Krishna as your child. Another possibility is to view yourself as as a gopi, as one of the milkmaids of Vrindavana, and see Krishna as your spouse. So that's the spiritual marriage with Krishna. And there's the different ways of approaching God. So it takes Bhakti Yoga takes into account our embodied nature and uses that where otherwise it would trap us to this world. It can be used for the sake of our own salvation, as long as we use it to attach ourselves to God. So I'm going to move now to basically the discussion of yoga of Dhyana Yoga, of meditation in the Bhagavad-Gita, which is dedicated mostly to the sixth chapter, the sixth canto of the Bhagavad-Gita. How much time have we got left?
I mean, well, officially, I think we are through. I mean, time is up, but you can take your time.
Okay, so I'm gonna keep the Sanskrit to really a minimum. So,
but some Sanskrit would be lovely.
Yes. Okay. I'll pick one. So Krishna explains to Arjuna the principles of Dhyana Yoga, of meditation. What's really interesting is, so in this verse, for the man of meditation wishing to attain purification of the heart, leading to concentration, work is said to be the way for him. When he has reached it, inaction is said to be the way. So this verse was discussed specifically by Shankara as a justification on his side to say that householders, so people who have a family, should not practice meditation. That meditation is something for the renouncers. However, other commentators like Ramanuja, for example, or Abhinavagupta, don't have any trace of that, because earlier on because this is the third verse of the sixth chapter, earlier on Krishna says that the person who abandons the fruits of his action is a true renouncant, is a true yogi, whether it's a householder or not. So for them, there's no question that a householder may completely be able to practice meditation. So Krishna then says, verily, when there is no attachment either to sense object or to actions, having renounced all sankalpas. So sankalpas is the objects of imagination, so the desires that we have. Then is one said to have attained concentration. A man should uplift himself by his own self, so let him not weaken his self. For this self is the friend of oneself, and this self is the enemy of oneself. It's of course well, the echoes of the saying of Imam Ali: the remedy is within yourself, the poison is within yourself. Right? All of us have this ability to basically uplift ourselves spiritually if we really want to. The self is the friend of the self for him who has conquered himself by this self. But to the unconquered self, this self is inimical, like a foe. To the self-controlled and serene, the supreme self is the object of constant realization in cold and heat, in pleasure and pain, as well as honor and dishonor. So the idea is really to go beyond the limitations of the poles of opposites, right? And to train yourself to be detached from them. Not necessarily indifferent, but detached, because indifference might actually be a symptom of depression. Rather, it's you acknowledge that they exist, but you're not moved by them, right? Whose heart is filled with satisfaction by gnosis and realization, and is changeless, whose senses are conquered, and to whom a lump of earth, a stone, and gold are the same. That yogi is called steadfast. He attains excellence who looks with equal regard upon well-wishers, friends, foes, neutrals, arbiters, the hateful, the relatives, and upon the righteous and the unrighteous alike. So it's a cultivation of compassion for all beings, even one's enemies. And you will see here the incorporation of the Mahayana idea of the bodhisattva, right? So the path of your own salvation basically goes through the desire of saving, of helping all beings, not just human beings, but all creatures. The yogi should constantly practice concentration of the heart, retiring into solitude alone with the mind and body subdued and free from hope and possession. Having established a cleanly spot on a cleanly spot his seat, firm, neither too high nor too low, made of cloth, skin, and kusha grass arranged in consecution. So first comes the kusha grass, then the skin, so either tiger skin or antelope skin, and then a cloth. And so the reason why he says not too high, not too low, it all has to do with making sure that your body posture is correct, so that the thing on which you're sitting on is not too low, because sitting on the floor in of itself will actually damage your spine, right? So you have to be seated on some sort of a cushion in order for basically your position to be correct. Why? So as to when you're meditating, you're not being distracted by the body, right? They're seated on that seat, making the mind one-pointed and subduing the action of the imagining faculty and the senses. Let him practice yoga for the purification of the heart. Let him hold head and neck straight and still gazing at the tip or beginning of his nose. So when they say gazing at the tip, it doesn't mean that you look crossed eyes at the tip of the nose. No, it just means that you look at the floor in front of you at an angle of 45 degrees, and you keep your eyes half closed. Or alternatively, you direct your gaze towards the Ajna chakra, the third eye, which is basically on your forehead between your eyebrows, and not looking around. With the heart serene and fearless, firm in the vow of a Brahmachari, again, right? The idea of Brahmacharya is very important here. With the mind controlled and ever thinking of me, let him sit, having me as a supreme goal. Thus, always keeping the mind steadfast, the yogi of subdued mind attains the peace residing in me, the peace which culminates in nirvana. Again, a very Buddhist notion here, right? So the Bhagavad-Gita absorbs here certain notions of Buddhism as well. Yoga is not for him who eats too much or too little, nor, or Arjuna, for him who sleeps too much and too little. The commentary of Shankaracharya is very interesting here. He mentions that the foods should be eaten in such a way that basically half should be, half of the food in your stomach should be solid food, 1/4 should be water, and then the rest should basically be empty. And that's a recommendation that's also given by Imam Ali regarding food as well. To him who is temperate in eating and recreation, in his effort for work, and in sleep and wakefulness, yoga becomes the destroyer of misery. When the completely controlled mind rests serenely in the self, alone, free from longing after all desires, then is one called steadfast. As a lamp in a spot sheltered from the wind does not flicker, even such has been the simile used for a yogi of subdued mind practicing concentration in the self. When the mind, absolutely restrained by the practice of concentration, attains quietude, and when seeing the self by the self, one is satisfied in his own self, when he feels that infinite bliss, which is perceived by the intellect and which transcends the senses, and is established wherein he never departs from his real state, and having obtained which regards no other acquisition superior to that, and where established he is not moved even by heavy sorrow, let that be known as a state called by the name of yoga, a state of severance from the contact of pain. This yoga. So basically, I'm just gonna finish the thing. So I'm jumping a few verses. So the results, the end result really is a combination of realization of the self, as well as basically viewing the self as the presence of the divine, of God in us. So Krishna says, with the heart concentrated by yoga, with the eye of evenness for all things, he beholds the self in all beings and all beings in the self. He who sees me, so Krishna says, Yo mam pashyati sarvatra sarvam cha mayi pashyati, tasyaham na pranashyami, same cha na pranashyati. So he says, who sees me in all things and sees all things in me, he never becomes separated from me, nor do I become separated from him. He who established in unity worships me, who am dwelling in all beings, whatever his mode of life, that yogi abides in me. He who judges of pleasure and pain everywhere by the same standard as he applies to himself or Arjuna is regarded as the highest. So the conclusions here are the following. Rather than just being a separate type of yoga, it seems that Dhyana or meditation or Raja Yoga is actually the prerequisite for the successful accomplishment of both of Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. So it is, in a sense, Dhyana Yoga is the processor, really, that enables these softwares, these Karma, Jnana, and Bhakti Yoga to actually even work properly. Why? Because, if you're practicing Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, or Bhakti Yoga, you're still working with the mind, you're still working with intention, and so on and so forth. And the only way to really master that is basically Dhyana Yoga. So rather than being one option, it seems that the Dhyana Yoga is has a more of a functional importance in terms of making sure that the other yogas actually function properly, right? The other thing is that the mystical union brings about the true nature of the golden rule, right? So do unto others as you would like, as you would do unto yourself. Here, with the last passage I've read, acquires a completely different dimension. It's not just a moralistic teaching; it's a teaching that derives from a mystical experience of the oneness of all things, because basically you see all beings as being contained in God, and you see the presence of God in all beings, and therefore you should, because the true self is also the presence of the divine in us, you should behave towards other in a mode that is defined by the very true nature of God, which is compassion. So, and most importantly here, rather than giving here the golden rule and other teachings as as the result of of deep discursive thinking, these teachings come from experiential knowledge of the divine, and that's seen as primordial. And this is what sets apart these sets of teachings from the works of philosophers or moralists or or ethicists. These teachings come from a true experience of reality. So when Krishna talks about the developing love for all beings, it's not just a moralistic teaching. It's because truly Krishna abides. Krishna is present in all beings because he is the divine spark that is present in all of creation. And yogic and basically yogic meditation is the way to actually experience that and really make sure that the golden rule doesn't become a rule that you have to force yourself to somehow practice. It just becomes the expression of the true self, right?
Wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for it.
I mean, when I was in Haridwar and living among these spending time with these sadhus, and ask questions about these famous figures, always pop up on your YouTube playlist, and they view them as clowns, right? These are people who don't have a proper knowledge of scripture, and they just make up these these things along, and people buy it, right? I'm not going to mention names because I don't want to give more publicity to these people, but funny people with funny turbans and beard and stuff, and playing the whole guru act. But truly, like within the tradition, they're not really seen as serious. And the thing is this: is that the study of the text is really important. Molière wrote a fantastic play about it called Tartuffe. It talks about these types of characters. It's I always remember the great figure of Allama Tabatabai, rahimahullah, who when too many people used to come to his classes, he used to become very nervous and sweat and find ways of avoiding being too popular, because he's very suspicious of these sort of things. And sometimes certain cults are not created by the gurus but by the disciples. So one has to a true teacher should always make sure that he has some mud on his clothes. Right. That there needs to be this malamati side to a teacher, in order to break that emotional dependence, right, that a student may have towards his teacher. This is why, by the way, I really like the Dalai Lama, because he always tries to break that. So like sometimes you see him just with some like really with a cap. And then he just says, well, in Tibetan Buddhism, you have the yellow cap Buddhism and the red cap Buddhism. But I prefer this baseball cap, and it's the idea of breaking this sort of, because people come into the spiritual path with a lot of unresolved, daddy issues very often, right? The time I was living in Pakistan, every single person that came to my office and told me about, oh, professor, I've stopped praying, I've stopped believing, 99% of the time where people had father issues, So problem is that cult figures tend to use that. They tend to use these unresolved mental issues that we all have, right? In order to exploit that.
I just wanted to know the difference between sort of meditation that you speak about and reflection. I mean, so is it going towards that? Like if you reflect on a single point, would that be?
No, so that's easy. See, I've encountered this a lot of times in the Muslim world, that there's sort of confusion between meditation and sort of a certain notion of tafakkur, right? Like reflecting upon something. But reflecting upon something is basically you're using your discursive mind, right? And you're using, you're looking at it from the point of view of either logic or going into depth of a subject, but with the tools of the discursive mind. That's not what meditation is. Meditation really is about attaining higher states of consciousness, where the knowledge about something basically is experienced, right, directly, instead of being something that you somehow discover through the same type of mind that you would use for a mathematics problem, right? There's different types of minds, right? And you need that as well. It's not that it's not useful. It's not. It should not be discarded. It's very useful. But it's a different type. There's a difference between reflecting on a verse of the Quran or the Bhagavad-Gita, using the tools of logic, of interpretation, and so on and so forth, right? And reflecting upon it, and also maybe also look at the symbolism of it and the relevance for one's own life. The difference between that and the process of meditation. Meditation is really, you experience that thing basically directly, right? So it's for example, in the case of the experience of God, it's not something. So it no longer is it's not something. It's not some sort of thought that you have about God. No, it's a direct experience of the divine, right? So, and that's why it's such a completely different type of knowledge. It's there's a fundamental difference here, and one that I always get into trouble with people. When I talk about the tahanuth of the Prophet, right? The periods of seclusion and that he went through in the mountains, right? And because we've, especially in the Muslim world, we've become so habituated with the figure of the thinker, and so a lot of people think, oh, the Prophet just went on this mountain and started thinking a lot, like, no, that's not what happens in 7th century Arabia. In 7th century Arabia, if you go to a mountain, you're practicing, breath and body mystical practices, because that's what the entire region is into. You're not a sort of like post-Hellenic Avicennian type of philosopher, thinking deeply about the subjects of life. But also because there's only so much time you can spend thinking, like that about something, and also because it just whereas that type of time of seclusion is actually necessary when going into these deep mystical states of consciousness, and also because medically speaking, these experiences have a specific difference of brain waves, basically, right? So you can have very deep thoughts using the same type of brain waves that I'm using right now. Just like, just a discursive mind, using my logic, using inference, and so on and so forth. And there's a difference between that and then basically samadhi, which is a complete different state of mind. And that's been that's been demonstrated medically, right? With experiments that have been done with yogis, especially Tibetan yogis. Using brain scans and whatnot when they're going into these alternate states of consciousness. It's a different thing, and that is I think one of the big sort of epistemological problems that I find in the Muslim world when addressing these notions, because we've been so used to the eradication of contemplative methods through either modernist movements or by the emergence of these extreme fiqh-based movements that are very often anti-mystical, that we've completely forgotten that we have this mystical tradition in Islam where it's all about dhawq, about experiencing the divine, not just having fancy thoughts, right? About the divine. You're actually experiencing it through visionary experience, right? And that's a completely different thing from having lofty thoughts about a subject. But the thing is that these visionary experiences require a certain training of the body, of the breath, of concentration, and withdrawing oneself from the flow of the discursive mind, which is also known as the monkey mind in the Dharmic traditions. Welcome.
But then one question pops up, then while the Eastern side was the Buddhists, the Hindus, and those were using these as contemplative methods. What was the other part of the world doing? I mean, do they have contemplative methods of different sorts, or like?
Well, actually, they do. But the thing is, with the emergence of modernity, they've been pushed underground. Like Catholicism has its meditation methods. If you read Teresa of Avila properly, or Ignatius of Loyola, or other great Catholic mystics, they have instructions on sitting, on breathing, on concentrating on a specific part of the body in order to achieve what they call contemplative prayer, right? They have for example, Ignatius of Loyola, the spiritual exercises. It's basically visualization techniques that that are also used in Tibetan Buddhism, right? For example, so you retire for 40 days with a spiritual teacher, and then each day is dedicated to a theme. And the first day is dedicated to meditating on the fire of hell. So you're supposed to visualize the fire of hell and how it's devouring you and eating you alive. And you're really supposed to experience it, right? Then the more pleasant one later. But so these meditation techniques, that you find them also in the Tantric tradition and in Tibetan Buddhism, right? But it's just that in the West, the West has this problem that it has this, body-mind dichotomy that it inherited from the Third Council of Constantinople, and it's not been able to really find a theory to explain visionary experience, and that's why it's always been very wary of mysticism and of contemplative methods. But they do exist. It's just that they've been pushed underground. Same thing for the Muslim world. We have especially the type of Sufism that you find in the Kubrawiya, for example. You have very specific instructions that are almost identical to the ones that you find in Tibetan meditation manuals. Very, very similar. And so these things do exist in Islam, but again, you can't build a political movement out of it. So
Yes,
and the thing is that they don't use victimhood mentalities, so they're not really useful in nowadays in the realms of politics, right? Whereas it's easier to basically conjure up resentment and whatnot in order to bring the crowds out and start movements and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So that's the issue. It's and of course the mistaken idea that somehow physically getting rid of the bad people in society is going to solve all problems. But yeah, that hasn't worked for any of the modern regimes of the 20th century, be it liberalism or fascism or communism, and certainly not Islamic socialism. Naqvi has a question.
Yeah, salam. So my question is that, so these three spiritual paths that you mentioned in your presentation, Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, and Jnana. So can someone achieve nirvana by following any of these three paths or not?
Well, yes, but here's the point I'm trying to make is that these yogas seem to presuppose that you're also practicing Dhyana yoga as well.
Okay.
There are, of course, people who disagree with me. For example, the founder of the Hare Krishna movement, Prabhupada, for him, the simple repetition of the names of Krishna, that's meditation for him. Because he is very wary of this whole Patanjali school of yoga, but in the Bhagavad-Gita it's quite clear. It's towards the rest of the chapter, Krishna puts a great deal of emphasis on the fact that this Dhyana yoga is actually essential, and that the practice of it is sort of somehow the foundation for the practice of all these three other types of yoga, right? So if you're practicing Karma Yoga, right, in the sense of, for example, Karma Yoga really is the yoga is most suited for people who live in the world and have a family, right?
Yeah.
So the issue is, how do I transform my daily activity into an act of compassion and service to God, right? So my actions are still the same, but how does my perspective change? But if we're talking about perspective, you're dealing with the mind, right? And unless your mind has been trained, has been directed towards the right direction, it's going to be really difficult. So that is why it's a combination of Dhyana yoga and Karma yoga, or Jnana yoga and Dhyana yoga, or Bhakti yoga and Jnana yoga, and Dhyana yoga, right? Meditation and Bhakti, meditation and Gnosis, meditation and Karma yoga, right? Rather than just meditation just on its own, or just Karma yoga on its own. No, it's a combination, because you're working with your mind. Unless your mind has been subdued, and you engage in Karma yoga, for example, there's the danger of spiritual hubris, right? Oh, look at me, I'm so pure, I'm so holy, So in order to be, you need to be watchful over yourself. Well, how do you do that unless you're practicing these mindfulness, right? Really, what it's all about. It's mindfulness. You need to be aware of these little tricks that both the nafs and shaitan play on us, right? Because for saintly people, shaitan will use religion as a tool to corrupt them. Like, oh, you're so holy, you're so special, you're better than all the others, and then you start believing that sort of stuff, And that's why God sometimes allows you to fall off the path, teach you lessons like, oh, you've got mud on your clothes as well. You're just as shitty as anyone else. and it's basically it's in order to create this necessary distance that you need to have from this witness consciousness that you absolutely need when engaging in these spiritual paths.
And one more thing. So some people, try to establish one-to-one correspondence between these three paths and the three parts in Islam, in Sufism, Makhafa, Mahabba, Marifa. So what is your take on this?
Well, I'm always wary of correspondences, but yes, in Islam we do have equivalents, right? Like Jnana is definitely Ma'arifa. It has an equivalent in Ma'arifa. Bhakti is definitely something that
Mahabba, Mahabba, yeah.
Yeah, it's Mahabba, right? It's Mahabba, and then of course Karma Yoga is it's a practice. Although it's also a very Confucian sort of thing. It's the idea that you find in basically Futua, right? The idea that your physical work should become an act of prayer. So, for example, Henri Corbin published these Futua Namas from medieval Iran and from the Mughal period, where you have these calico printers who have their own Futua Nama, their own manual of spiritual chivalry. And it says in there, so when you're printing the pattern on the cloth, you should imagine that the white cloth is your heart, and your heart should be as pure as this white cloth. And when you're printing the pattern on the cloth, print the heart of God onto your heart. So yes, that is a form of Karma Yoga. In the same way that, for example, blacksmith, when they're shaping, I don't know, sword or whatever, there's a dhikr that they repeat, right? So there is this idea there as well, and it's more found in the Futua Nama and the ethics of Futua, right? The idea of combining spirituality and especially craftsmanship, or any type of work really, but especially craftsmanship, and that excellence in one's work is seen as a worship, as an act of worship towards God. So you have that as well, and it's still something that you can find in I found a few traces of that in Iran, about amongst the people who still are still active in these traditional crafts. There still is this mentality, and this whole Guru Chela, relationship is still there. This being initiated by a teacher who not only teaches you the craft of calligraphy or carpentry or whatever, but also teaches you these mystical teachings about combining work with dhikr. And what's really interesting is that, for example, the Ni'matulaiya order, right? They put a lot of emphasis on not having any sort of special clothes, right? And that your dhikr should be silent. So, and they put a lot of emphasis on the fact that when you are working, that's when you should be doing your dhikr, especially. So, for example, if you're a carpenter, if you're working as a carpenter, you should practice the silent practice of dhikr khafi, right? The silent dhikr, where with your breathing you concentrate on your heart and you repeat the dhikr that's been taught to you by your master. And that's why also Sufi orders have always been very close to the guilds of craftsmen, right? And we lost so much from that, from that point of view, because we've allowed neoliberal economics to basically dictate the way we look at work, the very notion of work. What does it mean to work in Islamic civilization? There's very few people who have answered, who actually have looked into this question, right? I mean, and it's an important one. What does work mean? And so that is something that these notions of work within the culture of Futua very close to the idea of Karma Yoga in the Bhagavad-Gita, definitely.
Okay,
actually, thank you very much. I think
okay.
You can continue. Let me just get off the stream, I guess. Once again, thank you, Dr. Yusuf.
Yeah, so actually, the reason I was, I put forward this question of one-to-one correspondence was that, in Makhafa and Mahabba, in Makhafa, the aspect of fear is very dominant, and then in Mahabba, the aspect of love. Now, in both these aspects, because in Gnosis, the ultimate goal is to transcend the polarity of the Lord and the servant, to transcend the polarity of creator and creation. But in love and fear, intrinsically, this polarity is implied. So so in that sense, Gnosis seems to be the only option, where you can attain the supreme identity, or extinction, complete, contemplative extinction, according to Ibn Arabi. So if Makhafa and Mahabba, they correspond to Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga, even if you combine the Dhyana Yoga with it, even combining Dhyana Yoga with these two, can you still transcend this polarity, the Lord servant
Well,
polarity?
the thing is, the notion of fear is really absent from, especially the Vaishnava tradition. I mean, I've not come across any sort of fear of God in the Vaishnava Bhakti literature. So if, for example, the idea is that you should not sin out of love for Krishna, right? But there's no fear as such. There's no this idea. This very Abrahamic idea of the God that should be feared is really absent. So that the notion of Machafa is very strange to.
So it's not a perfect correspondence. So it's not a perfect.
No. I mean, karma is not Machafa. I mean, karma literally means work, right? Machafa is something else, right? So that's that notion. That notion is really absent. And one may ponder about the appropriateness of from the point of view of mental health, about the appropriateness of the use of Machafa. I'm saying this as because there's a spiritual path, and then on the side you have these people who end up in seeing a psychiatrist, or end up in a psychiatric institution because of some notions that have been taught to them in the wrong way. And God knows how many people, especially, for example, in the Muslim world, a lot of people who are really struck by this idea of fear of God, for example, or suffer from OCD because of the overemphasis on on fiqh and on a juridical. So here's the thing. It's there's a spiritual path, but then you have all these other casualties that come from bad teaching, and also the fact that there's no structure to really take care of such people, or to look at them in a, because for example, people who suffer with waswas, right? If they go to a sheikh, they'll be told, oh, it's the shaitan playing tricks with you. How dare you allow him to do that to you? Well, that's not helpful. It just makes things worse. And so there's the that's why I've always I've always tried to basically encourage the practice of mindfulness in these things within the Muslim world, because unfortunately, because of circumstances that would be too long to explain, we've drifted towards this direction that is really creating a lot of casualties. A lot of, because it's destroying families. Like anyone who has a relative in their family who suffers from heavy waswas, right, heavy OCD type of behavior, it can really destroy a family. And unfortunately, there's no structure to take care of them, because the clergy on one hand will say, well, it's your fault because you're letting the shaitan influence you. Well, maybe you guys should explain the fiqh better, or you should explain it in such a way that people do not fear, do not experience some sort of terror when they have doubts about whether or not they've done their ghusl or wudu properly, right? So, that's what I was talking about, these unresolved issues that nobody wants to talk about. And when people enter the spiritual path with all these unresolved issues, it very often results in these psychiatric problems, and that's that's something that a lot of religious authorities do not even want to touch with a barge pole, because that would be questioning their authority and their precision stuff. The problem is this: is that when you see people suffer from this, it breaks your heart, right? So yeah, I would say just go easy on the Mahabharata.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot.